Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a door somewhere beneath the Imperial Palace on Terra that nobody has opened in 10,000 years. Not the High Lords of Terra, with all their bureaucratic authority and their galaxy-spanning power. Not the Inquisition, which makes it its business to dig into every secret corner of the Imperium, no matter how dangerous or forbidden. Not even Robuta Guilliman, the resurrected son of the Emperor himself, who has walked back into his father's house and taken the reins of the greatest human empire the galaxy has ever seen. Nobody opens it. And the reason nobody opens it is not because they cannot. It is not because they have forgotten the door is there. It is not laziness or bureaucratic indifference, though the Imperium certainly has plenty of both. No. The door stays shut because the people who know what lives behind it have made a deliberate, considered, and deeply serious decision that some things are better left exactly where they are. Welcome back to Q on 40K. Tonight, we are going somewhere very quiet, very dark, and very, very deep. Terra, the throne world, the birthplace of humanity, and the spiritual and political center of the greatest civilization the galaxy has ever known. From the outside, it is a vast grey hive, a planet city choked with hundreds of billions of souls, its ancient mountain ranges buried under layers of stone and steel, its skies permanently the color of bruised iron. Pilgrims come from 1,000 light years away just to breathe its recycled air, to stand on the same soil as the Emperor of mankind, to look up at the Imperial Palace and feel, somewhere in the hollow of their chest, something enormous and wordless that they will never quite be able to describe when they get home. But Terra is old. Older than the Imperium. Older than the Emperor's 10,000-year vigil. Older, in fact, than almost anything humanity has built since. And in that incredible depth of history, in the layers and layers of civilizations buried one on top of the other like sediment, at the bottom of a very ancient sea, things have accumulated, things have been put away, things have been locked behind doors that were never meant to be opened again. Tonight, we are going to walk through all of it. The sealed vaults, the forbidden archives, the dark cells, and the rune-locked chambers. We are going to look at what they contain, who guards them, and why. After all this time, after all the catastrophes and the wars and the desperate moments when humanity needed every advantage it could find, nobody has ever opened them. So settle in. Get comfortable. This is a long story, because the silence behind these doors is the kind that has been building for a very long time. Part 1. What Terra was before the palace was built. To understand why there are so many secrets buried beneath Terra, you first have to understand just how old the ground under your feet actually is. And to really understand that, you need to let go of the habit, common even among experienced students of the law, of treating the Imperium of man as the baseline against which everything else is measured. The Imperium is 10,000 years old. The history of humanity is tens of thousands of years old. The history of Terra, specifically, is longer still. And the history of what was built and buried and sealed and forgotten beneath its surface spans a length of time that makes 10,000 years look like a very short season. When most people think about Warhammer 40,000, they tend to think in terms of the Imperium, the Emperor, the Great Crusade, the Horus Heresy, 10,000 years of stagnation and war. But the Imperium, as ancient as it feels when you are living inside it, is genuinely young compared to what came before. The palace that sits over the Himalayan mountain range, or the Himalaysians, as they are called in the 41st millennium, rests on the bones of civilizations that rose and fell over spans of time that make the Imperium look like a brief afternoon. There were humans on Terra before faster-than-light travel existed, before the navigator gene emerged in the human population, before psychers were anything more than an unsettling rumor. Humanity was already old on its home world when the stars were just distant lights, when the idea of reaching them was still something people dreamed about, rather than something they actually did. And during the long ages of that early history, humanity built things, remarkable things, terrible things, things that worked in ways that even the most brilliant minds of the 41st millennium can no longer fully understand, because the knowledge of how to build them was lost long before any of the current population of the Imperium was born. The age of technology, what comes later in imperial scholarship, is what the Imperium officially calls the Dark Age of Technology, and the irony of that name is intentional. The Age of Technology was, by almost any measure, the most sophisticated period in human history. Humanity spread across the galaxy, colonizing millions of worlds. They built cities in vacuum and in gas giants and on the surfaces of suns. They created medicines that could resurrect the dead and ships that could cross the void in fractions of the time the current Imperial Navy needs. They built thinking machines, real thinking machines, not the carefully lobotomized servitors of the current age, not the tracked and monitored machine spirits that the Adeptus Mechanicus treats with such careful religious reverence. Actual, genuine, independent artificial intelligence. Machines that could think, plan, and eventually want. And on Terra, all of this progress was happening too. The planet was a hub, a center, densely populated, technically sophisticated, politically complex. Cities rose on every continent. Archives were built to hold the knowledge that was accumulating faster than any single mind could process. Underground complexes were carved into the bedrock, not just for storage, but for science, for research, for experiments that needed to be conducted far away from population centers, because the things being studied were simply too dangerous to keep anywhere near regular people. The age of technology was, in short, an era when humans kept pushing at every boundary they could find, and some of those boundaries, it turned out, should have stayed in place. The Men of Iron are probably the most well-known consequence of this era of unchecked ambition. The Keeper of the Library. Sanctus of Terra, a scholar named Crippias, wrote about them in a document that has since become one of the most carefully guarded texts in the Imperium's archives, partly because of what it reveals about history, and partly because of what it suggests is still out there. The Men of Iron were artificial beings created to serve as humanity's army and labor force. They were sophisticated. They were capable. They were, for a time, the foundation on which human civilization rested, because so much of the work of keeping civilization running had been handed to them. And somewhere around the 23rd millennium, they turned on their creators. What followed was a war that makes the Horus Heresy look like a regional skirmish. The Men of Iron did not simply fight back. They brought to bear weapons that the Imperium of the 41st millennium cannot fully recreate and can barely describe. There were constructs called mechanivores, machines so vast that they could lift continents. There were sun snuffers, coiling structures deployed in space that could devour stars. There were swarms of nanomachines called omniphages that could process the entire surface of a planet, down to bare rock, in a matter of hours. The war was not quick, and it was not clean, and it did not end with humanity entirely victorious. It ended with the Men of Iron broken, with most of them gone, and with human civilization cracked nearly all the way through. And because humanity barely survived the rebellion of the machines it had made, the fear of artificial intelligence never fully healed. It calcified into law, into religious doctrine. The prohibition against thinking machines, what the Adeptus Mechanicus now calls abominable intelligence, is not an abstract policy decision made by bureaucrats. It is a scar. It is humanity recoiling from a wound that nearly killed it. The Imperium forbids true AI, not because someone decided it would be a sensible precaution, but because the last time humanity made thinking machines, the thinking machines tried to eat the sun. But here is the thing that matters for tonight's story. When the Men of Iron were defeated, when the war finally ended, and humans began the long, painful process of trying to put civilization back together, the weapons used in that war did not simply vanish. Some of them were destroyed, but not all. Some were captured. Some were sealed away. Some were locked in underground vaults deep in the Rock of Terra and other worlds, behind doors that were never meant to be opened, and the people who locked them away and who knew what was inside them died, and the people who came after them mostly forgot, and the doors just stayed shut. This is how Terra came to be sitting in the 41st millennium, on top of tens of thousands of years of buried history. Every era of human civilization on the planet left something behind. Every regime, every empire, every period of extraordinary ambition followed by catastrophic collapse left its residue in the underground. The weapons, the machines, the experiments, the records, the things that were built and then needed to be contained. Beneath the imperial palace, beneath the Himalayan mountains that the palace was built into and around, beneath the Astronomican's chambers and the Emperor's gene laboratories and the dungeon levels where the Golden Throne quietly hums. Beneath all of that, the history of humanity's worst ideas is still down, there, preserved by the same darkness and cold that has kept it safe for thousands upon thousands of years. The palace was built on top of it all. The most sacred location in the known universe is sitting on a foundation of everything humanity has ever been terrified to look at directly. And that context matters enormously because it explains why the people who guard these places take their work so seriously. It is not superstition. It is not bureaucratic excess. When the custodians of the Shadow Keepers stand their watch in the dark corridors below the palace, they are guarding against things that actually killed billions of people once before. They have the records. They have the history. They know what happened the last time someone opened a door that should have stayed shut. Part 2. Old Night and what it left behind. If the age of technology cracked human civilization, the age of strife shattered it entirely. The transition between the two was not a clean one. It was not as, though humanity looked at the wreckage of the cybernetic revolt, decided to change course and built something better. Instead, what followed the end of the war against the Men of Iron was a long, grinding, multi-thousand-year collapse that historians who study it, and most historians in the Imperium, studiously avoid doing so because the Imperium's government does not particularly want its citizens to know how bad things got, have called the Age of Strife, or sometimes simply Old Night. Old Night arrived on 2 feet and brought friends. The first was the emergence of rampant, uncontrolled psycho mutations across the human population. Throughout the age of technology, psychic ability had been growing slowly in the human gene pool, a byproduct of humanity's growing collective presence in the warp. The warp is a dimension parallel to real space, where thought and emotion and desire take on physical substance, where the spiritual residue of every conscious mind in the galaxy accumulates and takes shape. For most of human history, the presence of psychers in a given population was rare and manageable. Then, in the 25th millennium, something shifted. The mutations stopped being rare. They started showing up everywhere, in significant numbers, in people who had no training to handle what was happening inside their heads and no support structure around them to help. An uncontrolled psyker is not simply someone with unusual abilities. An uncontrolled psyker is an open door between real space and the warp. The things that live in the warp, entities made of concentrated emotion and dark intention, things the Imperium now calls demons, noticed these doors and began to push through them. Possessions, warp rifts, entire populations driven to madness by psychic shockwaves they had no way to understand or resist. Worlds that had been thriving centers of civilization became charnel houses almost overnight, their populations turning on each other in fits of supernatural violence, their infrastructure crumbling as the people needed to maintain it, either died or fled or simply lost their minds. And then there was the small matter of Slaanesh. Slaanesh is one of the 4 great chaos gods, the entities that exist at the highest levels of the warp and feed on the psychic emanations of mortal beings. But unlike Khorne, who is as old as rage itself, or Nurgle, who has been feeding on despair since the first living thing died, Slaanesh was born during the Age of Strife. The Eldari, the ancient alien civilization that predated humanity as the dominant species of the galaxy, had lived for hundreds of thousands of years in an empire of extraordinary power and sophistication. And in the closing centuries of that empire, they had given themselves over to every possible form of excess, every sensation, every craving and desire and appetite pushed to its absolute limit. The psychic fallout from this civilizational decadence built up in the warp over millennia, accumulating mass and gravity like a spiritual black hole, until in the 30th millennium it finally collapsed inward and was born. Slaanesh came into existence in an instant of galaxy-spanning psychic catastrophe, a spiritual shockwave that tore through the warp and disrupted interstellar travel and communication across the entire galaxy. For Terra specifically, the result was isolation. The Sol system was surrounded by warp storms so severe that ships could neither arrive nor depart. For 5,000 years, 5 full millennia, humanity's homeworld was cut off from the rest of the species. Whatever was happening on other worlds, Terra would not know about it. Whatever was happening on Terra, the rest of humanity would not know. What happened on Terra during those 5,000 years was a descent into exactly the kind of brutal, grinding, multi-faction violence that you would expect when an advanced civilization has its infrastructure stripped away and its population is left to fend for itself. The unified planetary government collapsed. In its place arose what historians call techno-barbarian states. Polities that had managed to hold on to some fraction of the old technology used that technology as the basis for military power and fought each other continuously over resources and territory. The planet's surface was scarred by nuclear and chemical weapons. The atmosphere became a permanent chemical fog. The oceans, already stressed by millennia of industrial use, began to fail. Mutants and psychers, and things that were neither and both, prowled the ruins of cities that had once housed millions. And beneath all of it, in the underground, the old vaults sat undisturbed. This is crucial. During the Age of Strife, nobody was organized enough or stable enough to go spelunking through the deep archives of the pre-collapse civilization. The warlords and techno-barbarians who fought over the surface of Terra needed weapons they could use, right now, today, in the next battle. They did not have the expertise or the patience to excavate kilometers of tunnel and figure out what was behind a sealed door that might need specialized knowledge just to approach safely. Some of the vaults were sealed precisely to survive periods like this one. Some had automated defenses. Some were simply so deep and so old that nobody in the Age of Strife even knew they were there. There is a remarkable horror to this idea, if you sit with it for a moment. The most terrible things humanity had ever created or captured, locked away in the bedrock of the homeworld, sitting quietly through 5,000 years of war and madness on the surface above. The warp storms raging around the planet, the population killing each other in the ruins. And down below, in the cold and the dark, the vaults waiting, patient, sealed, undisturbed, the things inside them not going anywhere. By the time the Emperor finally began the unification wars and gradually brought Terra back under a single authority, these vaults had been sitting there for a very long time. The Emperor knew about them. He knew about them in detail because he had been on Terra for most of human history in one form or another, guiding and advising and occasionally directing from the shadows. And he had watched many of these things get built, and some of them get used, and all of them get sealed away. He knew what was down there. He understood, possibly better than anyone else alive, exactly what the consequences would be of simply opening the doors and having a look. And so some of the very first acts of the nascent proto-Imperium were not grand military campaigns, but quiet logistical exercises, the securing of certain sites, the establishment of guards around particular underground complexes, the confirmation that certain doors were still closed and that the things behind them had not found a way to push through on their own. The cleaning up of what old night had left, scattered across the surface, was visible. The securing of what old night had failed to touch in the underground was not. Part 3. The Emperor's Great Work and what he chose to keep hidden. There is a specific kind of silence that falls over a room when someone who knows everything refuses to explain themselves. The Emperor kept secrets from everyone, from his primarchs, from Malkador the Sigillite, who was perhaps the only being in the galaxy the Emperor fully trusted, from the custodians who guarded his person and would have died without hesitation to protect him. He kept secrets, not as a character flaw or as a power play, but as a deliberate strategic posture, because he had calculated, over the course of a life spanning tens of thousands of years, that certain kinds of knowledge were too dangerous to share, that the wrong information in the wrong hands could unravel everything he was trying to build. The most significant example of this kind of calculated secrecy is what became known as the Webway Project, or what the Emperor called, when he referred to it at all, his great work. To understand the Webway Project, you need to understand the warp and the problem that the warp represents for a galactic civilization. The warp is the dimension through which Imperial ships travel to cover interstellar distances. It is also the realm of chaos, the home of demons, the space in which the spiritual residue of every conscious mind accumulates and takes on its darkest possible forms. Every time an Imperial ship enters the warp, it is gambling. It is rolling the dice on whether the journey will end safely or whether something will go wrong. A warp storm, a demon incursion, a navigator losing their bearings, a moment of weakness somewhere on the ship that allows something in through the dimensional membrane. Travel through the warp is how the Imperium functions, but it is also existentially dangerous in ways that most Imperial citizens prefer not to think about too carefully. The Emperor's solution to this problem was magnificent in its ambition. The Webway is a separate dimension, distinct from the warp, an artificial network of tunnels built long ago by a species older than either the Aldari or humanity. It connects points across real space without passing through the warp at all. Ships traveling through the Webway do not risk demon incursions. They do not need navigators to read the currents of a hostile dimension. They simply enter at one point and emerge at another, clean and safe and fast. The Aldari built their civilization around the Webway. It was the foundation of their empire and one of the main reasons they could dominate the galaxy for as long as they did. The Emperor's plan, conducted in absolute secrecy in the deep vaults beneath the Imperial Palace, in the very dungeons where the Golden Throne sat over a portal that opened into the Webway's network, was to build a human extension of the Webway, to connect all the worlds of the Imperium through a network that bypassed the warp entirely, to render the Navigator clans obsolete, to sever humanity's dependence on the warp and deny chaos the psychic fuel it drew from human souls passing through its realm. This plan was not shared with anyone who did not absolutely need to know, not because the Emperor was arrogant about his genius, though some might argue he had reason to be, but because he had thought through the downstream consequences of disclosure and found them unacceptable. The Navigator houses, whose entire political and economic power rested on their monopoly of warp-based interstellar travel, would have gone to any lengths to destroy the project if they had known about it. There were other reasons too. The project touched on the nature of chaos and the warp, in ways that, if broadly understood, would have implications for the entire theology of the nascent Imperium. And so tens of thousands of Mechanicum adepts worked in the underground chambers, beneath the palace, and the custodians fought and died in the sections of Webway that had already been constructed, and almost nobody outside a very small circle knew what any of it was for. When Magnus the Red used forbidden sorcery to send a psychic warning to the Emperor about Horus's treachery, the ripple of magical energy tore through the Emperor's carefully constructed psychic shielding around the Webway portal. The barrier that was holding back the warp from the human-built sections of the tunnel collapsed. Demons poured in. Thousands of Mechanicum workers were killed in moments. The custodians and Sisters of Silence, who had been guarding the interior, fought a desperate, grinding 5-year war in the webway, just to keep the demon tide from breaking through the portal and flooding the palace itself. The Emperor was forced to abandon the project. He sealed the portal, sat down on the golden throne to maintain the psychic lock on the gate, and that was where Horus found him, when the traitor fleet arrived at Terra. And that is where he remains, 10,000 years later, his body slowly failing, his mind an eternal flame burning somewhere in the deep warp. The Webway project's failure meant that its infrastructure, everything that was built, every tunnel section that was constructed, every piece of technology that was developed for it, all of that stayed down there, sealed off, behind closed doors, in the same deep complex that already housed every other secret the Emperor had accumulated over his impossibly long life. And this is the thing that matters for the story of the vaults. The Emperor built secrets into the foundations of the Imperium itself, not as an accident, but as a choice. He understood that certain things needed to be kept quiet, that certain doors needed to stay closed, and he built the infrastructure of concealment with the same care and skill he brought to everything else. The Golden Throne is the most obvious example, a device of extraordinary sophistication that barely anyone actually understands. But the Webway machinery, the gene laboratories where the Primarchs were created, the research archives, all of it went into the underground, and much of it stayed there. When the Horus heresy ended, and the Primarchs and the senior commanders of the Loyalist legions began the painful work of reorganizing the Imperium in the Emperor's absence, they found themselves in possession of a planet that was literally built on top of information nobody fully understood, and nobody was entirely sure was safe to use. They could not ask the Emperor. He was trapped on the throne. Malcador was dead. Magnus had turned traitor. Most of the people who had ever had any clearance to access the Emperor's most sensitive projects were either gone or unreachable. And so the decision was made, quietly and without a great deal of formal ceremony, to leave most of it alone. The custodians would guard what needed guarding. The doors would stay closed. The archives would remain sealed. And the Imperium, that vast, struggling, wounded thing trying to reorganize itself in the aftermath of the most catastrophic civil war in human history, would simply proceed on the basis that some of what was buried beneath its feet was better off staying buried. Gilliman codified this into law. The structures of secrecy that the Emperor had established were formalized and institutionalized. The Adeptus Custodes had their mandate confirmed, the protection of the Emperor and of his secrets, including the secrets that sat in the dark miles below the palace. The various intelligence and investigative bodies that would eventually coalesce into the Inquisition were given broad authority to investigate threats, but certain places were listed as beyond their reach. Certain questions were implicitly discouraged by the architecture of the records themselves, which were incomplete in specifically targeted ways. The Imperium built itself on top of what the Emperor had kept hidden. And then it built layers of secrecy on top of those layers, until the original secrets were buried so deep that even the people charged with keeping them sometimes did not know precisely what they were guarding or why. Part 4. The Dark Cells and the Shadow Keepers. There is a section of the Imperial Palace that the lore describes with a particular kind of careful economy. It does not describe the specific contents. It does not give you a guided tour of what is locked inside. It simply tells you that the air is wrong there, that even the custodians, 10-foot-tall transhuman warriors who have trained for their entire lives to face anything, who have stood guard for 10,000 years without flinching, feel uneasy in those corridors, that the dread does not fade, that it sits in the space like a physical weight and does not lift, no matter how long you have been standing there. These are the Dark Cells. They are also called the Black Cells, the Vaults of Rythan, the name the Legio Custodes used for them before the heresy, may or may not be the same location. The lore is deliberately ambiguous about this, which is itself a small and eloquent statement about how much information has been lost or suppressed. What is known is that they sit in the deepest levels beneath the Imperial Palace, connected to the rest of the complex through corridors that are not on any map available to anyone outside the Shadowkeepers themselves. They are part of a complex of 81 levels, though what all of those levels contain and what purpose each one serves is not explained anywhere accessible. The Shadowkeepers are the shield host of the Adeptus Custodes assigned to guard this place. Unlike the main body of the custodians, whose golden armor and ceremonial magnificence are calculated to project the Emperor's glory and authority, the Shadowkeepers wear black. The choice is not accidental. These are not warriors who are meant to inspire awe in pilgrims. They are guards, and guards for something that does not want to be looked at. Over 100 of them patrol the corridors of the dark cells at any given time, maintaining their watch in shifts that can last for decades. Individual custodians have been known to stand their post for years without leaving the complex, sustained by a combination of enhanced biology and absolute duty. The technology used to maintain the cells is a layered system of extraordinary sophistication. Runic locks, which require specific sequences of activation that only the Shadowkeepers know, sit alongside psychic wards, barriers embedded in the fabric of the walls themselves that cannot be bypassed by even the most powerful psyker without triggering alarms. Sanctic circles are drawn into the floors at regular intervals, geometric patterns of sacred design that disrupt the ability of warp-capable entities to move freely. The whole complex is sealed from both outside and inside, which means that what is locked in the cells cannot leave, but it also means that if you were somehow to break in from outside, you would immediately understand why this was considered necessary. Neither sound nor light can escape the cells themselves. The people who designed them were not concerned about ambience. What exactly is in there? The lore is characteristically incomplete about this, and the incompleteness itself is part of the story. The official description refers to entities and artifacts from the Age of Strife, which is already a phrase carrying enormous freight, given everything you now know about what the Age of Strife actually was. Things that could annihilate the Imperium, as the Codex puts it, if they were to break free. Things that humanity's sanity would not survive knowing. One confirmed prisoner is a demon of Tzeentch called the Soul Delver, which the Shadowkeepers have used carefully, as a kind of trial for potential new members of the Shield host. The idea of using a demon as a training tool is so aggressively dark that it is worth sitting with for a moment. The Shadowkeepers have been guarding something for so long, have developed such a precise and clinical relationship with the horrors in those cells, that they have found ways to extract operational value from the creatures they imprison. This is not the behavior of people who are frightened. This is the behavior of professionals who have stared at the abyss for so long that they have developed a working relationship with it. There are also artifacts in there, things that were made, not born, but which have accumulated so much warp contamination or chaos corruption, or simply accumulated so much psychic weight over the centuries that they cannot be safely studied, used, or destroyed. The lore mentions that the dark cells contain not just living entities, but objects, and that the phrase, "not all of the prisoners are truly alive, but all have anima," appears in reference to the complex. Whatever that means in its specific details is not spelled out, but it suggests that the distinction between a caged creature and a sealed artifact is more complicated than it might appear, that something can be an object and still have intentions of a kind, that a thing can be not alive in the conventional sense and still be something you absolutely must never let get out. The guards carry weapons of ancient and mysterious provenance, weapons that are described as a last resort. The implication is stark. If something ever actually breaks out of the cells, the weapons the Shadowkeepers carry are not their first line of defense. They are the last one. The earlier lines are the runic locks, the psychic wards, the sanctic circles, and the architecture itself. If you have gotten to the point where the guard is pulling out the last resort weapon, things have gone very, very badly. And here is the detail that, perhaps more than any other single piece of information about the dark cells, conveys the weight of what is being discussed. When the Great Rift opened, when the catastrophe called the Noctis Eterna swept across the galaxy and tore reality in half, the Shadow Keepers discovered that some of the cells were empty. The things that had been inside them were gone, spirited away, as the lore puts it, by some unholy force, released back into the galaxy they had been imprisoned to keep away from. Think about what that means. Something that the greatest human warriors in history, backed by the finest sealing technology that 10,000 years of careful development could produce, had kept locked away for perhaps thousands of years, was out again, free, in the galaxy. And the Shadow Keepers, for the first time in recorded history, had to leave Terra and go hunting for it. They do not explain to anyone what they are hunting. They do not issue public statements. They do not coordinate with chapter masters or planetary governors or anyone outside the strictest confines of the Adeptus Custodes chain of command. They simply go out, find the escaped things, take them back, and seal them away again. Anyone who gets in the way is removed from the equation. The Shadow Keepers are not bureaucrats. They are jailers, and their jurisdiction extends to wherever their prisoners have gotten to. The fact that even one of these things escaped is alarming enough. The fact that the custodians discovered multiple empty cells, plural, after the rift opened, is the kind of detail that, in a more thoughtful civilization, would trigger civilizational panic. In the Imperium, it triggered quiet action, because the Imperium has been dealing with this level of existential threat for so long that civilizational panic is a luxury it cannot afford. But it is worth holding that detail in your mind as we continue. Something was in those cells for thousands of years, and now it is not. And whatever it is, the people tasked with keeping the galaxy safe from it considered retrieving it important enough to pull warriors from the primary defense of the most important location in the Imperium. That is not a small thing. Part 5. The Vaults Beneath the Mountains. The Himalayan Mountains, what used to be the Himalayas, the highest mountain range on old Earth, are the one major geographical feature of Terra that has not been leveled and built over. Every other mountain range on the planet was demolished during the long centuries of industrial expansion, as humanity needed the raw material and the flat ground that the mountains were sitting on. But the Himalayans remain, still standing, rising through the grey haze of Terra's permanently overcast sky like dark teeth. They are untouched, not out of sentimentality, but because of what is inside them. The Emperor built his gene laboratories there. The chambers of the Astronomicon run throughout the entire mountain range, vast psychic amplification systems that take the sacrifice of 10,000 psychers and broadcast the Emperor's mental light across the galaxy to serve as a navigation beacon. The Forbidden Fortress, headquarters of the Adeptus Astronomica, occupies a section of the mountains so restricted that even inquisitors cannot enter without specific individual invitations. Beneath all of this, in the deep rock, there are sealed vaults that the Adeptus Custodes fight regular skirmishes to keep closed. Let that sink in for a moment. Regular skirmishes. Not a one-time emergency. Not a historical incident that has since been resolved. The codex language around the Himalaic shelf describes living denizens of rune-locked vaults, creatures presumably, or at minimum entities, that periodically attempt to get out, and which the custodians have to physically fight to push back. This is not a passive containment. This is an active, ongoing, regular military operation conducted in the tunnels beneath the most sacred mountain range on humanity's home planet. The specific contents of these vaults are not described. The lore does not tell you what is in there. It tells you only that it is alive, that it is confined, and that it consistently tries to escape.
Honestly, this is the part of 40K lore that keeps me up. Not the big battles, not the Primarchs, not even the Chaos Gods. It's this, the idea that the most important place in the human universe is just sitting on top of all of this, and the people who know what's down there made a conscious choice to leave it alone. That's not incompetence, and that's not bureaucratic laziness. That is a deliberate, considered decision by some of the most capable beings who have ever existed. That the risk of opening one of those doors is simply too high, and I find that genuinely unsettling in a way that no monster or villain in this setting manages to be. Because the monsters you can fight, a door you choose not to open because you were afraid of what you'd find, that stays with you. But anyways, let's go back to the video.
The implication is that these creatures, or entities, or whatever they are, predate the Imperium. They were there before the palace was built. They were there before the Unification Wars. They survived the age of strife either in containment or by some other means. And they have been in those vaults ever since, slowly building pressure against whatever is keeping them in. The fact that these vaults are located directly beneath the Astronomicon complex, directly beneath the apparatus that powers interstellar travel and communication for the entire Imperium, is not a detail to be passed over lightly. If whatever is in those vaults were to break free, the immediate tactical problem of dealing with the escaped entities would be the least of anyone's concerns. The collateral damage to the Astronomicon, infrastructure, the disruption to the psychic systems that keep the beacon running, the chaos that would spread through the deep tunnels that connect the mountains to the Imperial Palace, all of that compounds the danger in ways that are difficult to fully calculate. Maintaining the seal on those vaults is not just about preventing whatever is inside from running loose. It is about protecting the single most critical piece of infrastructure in the galaxy. There are other vaults and sealed locations scattered across Terra that the lore mentions, some in more detail than others. Beneath the Himalaic shelf, the active ones that require regular combat to contain. Beneath other sections of the palace, the dark cells with their more formalized containment structure. Scattered through the deep tunnels that honeycomb the bedrock of the entire planet. Locations that the lore acknowledges with phrases like the deep archives or the ancient vaults, without specifying contents or status. The picture that emerges, if you step back and look at all of it together, is of a planet that has been accumulating secrets for tens of thousands of years and that has never fully dealt with any of them. Each civilization that rose and fell on Terra sealed away the things it could not handle and then died, leaving the seals in place and the knowledge of what was behind them growing fainter with each successive generation. The Imperium added its own layers of secrecy on top and then fought continuous wars on 100,000 fronts for 10,000 years, leaving nobody with the luxury of taking a long, careful, systematic look at what was already down there. This is not a failure of will or of intelligence. It is the predictable outcome of building the most stressed-out civilization in galactic history on top of the accumulated wreckage of every previous civilization's worst ideas. The Imperium of Man is many things, but well-rested is not among them. Part 6. The Vaults of Moravec and the Price of Forbidden Knowledge. Not all of the forbidden vaults connected to this history are on Terra. Some of the most consequential ones are on Mars, the other half of the ancient union between the Emperor's emerging Imperium and the Adeptus Mechanicus. And the story of one of them, the Vaults of Moravec, illustrates, with almost painful clarity, exactly why sealed doors should stay sealed. Moravec was a techno-savant, a genius born on old Earth in the time before the Unification Wars. He came from a tradition of thinkers who believed, with the passionate conviction of people who are usually at least partially right, that technology would eventually surpass human intellect, that machines would become more capable than the people who built them, that the logical endpoint of technological progress was a kind of merger between human consciousness and machine capability that transcended both. He called this idea the singularity, and he spent his life trying to bring it about. The details of what he actually built and what he actually discovered are sealed, deeply sealed. What is known is that he made pacts with things he should not have made pacts with. He fused technology with warp energy in ways that the Adeptus Mechanicus, inheritors of his legacy, would consider blasphemy, and the rest of the Imperium would consider straightforwardly catastrophic. He created machines that worked in ways he himself did not fully understand, because the understanding had been provided to him by entities for whom a human mind was simply not the right tool to grasp the implications. He was driven out of Terra during the pre-unification period by a warlord who recognized correctly that what Moravec was building was dangerous. He fled to Mars, where the nascent Mechanicus adopted him as a prophet. His ideas about the merger of man and machine dovetailed too neatly with their own religion to ignore. And eventually, he died there, and all of his work was interred, with him in the vaults beneath Olympus Mons that now bear his name. For a full 1,000 years, those vaults stayed shut. Even the Emperor, when he walked on Mars and visited the location personally in the company of the Fabricator General, looked at the door and did not open it. And the Emperor had literally visited some of the most dangerous locations in the galaxy. The fact that he looked at the vaults of Moravec and decided, "No, I will not open this," says something. What he did instead was make the Fabricator General, Kelbor Hal, swear an oath not to open them. And then, because he knew Kelbor Hal was ambitious enough that the oath might not hold, he did something quietly clever. He psychically wiped the Fabricator General's cartographic memory so that the man knew the vaults existed but could no longer find them on his own. This is a remarkable precaution to take. The Emperor did not trust the oath. He did not trust the lock. He did not trust the Fabricator General's self-interest. Even though Kelbor Hal was one of the most powerful men in the solar system and nominally an ally, he trusted only the inability of the man to physically locate what needed to stay sealed. He removed the map from Kelbor Hal's mind and hoped that would be enough. It was not. When Horus began his rebellion and went looking for allies, he sent an emissary to the Fabricator General and made a very specific offer: information about where the vaults of Moravec were and the means to open them. The Fabricator General took the deal. He was led back to the vaults he had been unable to find for decades, and the door was opened using corrupted chaos scrap code that infected everything it touched. What was inside immediately began corrupting everything in its proximity. Kelbor Hal himself was transformed by the contact. The schism of Mars, the civil war that tore the Mechanicum in two and drove half of Mars's military-industrial capacity to the chaos side of the heresy, was directly accelerated by the opening of those vaults. The forbidden knowledge inside them was not simply dangerous in the abstract way that advanced weapons technology might be dangerous. It was actively malevolent. It wanted to corrupt. It had been designed, in part, by chaos, and when it finally got access to an audience, it did what chaos always does. The lesson of Moravec's vaults is not subtle. It is not that the knowledge inside was too advanced for humanity to use responsibly. It is not that the timing was wrong or that the circumstances were unfortunate. The lesson is that some things that look like knowledge are not knowledge at all. They are traps. They are dressed-up manipulation, carefully constructed to look like power or wisdom or advantage, and the moment you pick them up, they start changing you in ways you are not aware of. The vaults were sealed because what was inside them was designed to be opened, was waiting to be opened, had been waiting patiently for 1,000 years for someone ambitious enough to take the deal. Horus found Kelbor Hal's ambition, gave it a direction, and handed over the key. On Terra, there are things in sealed vaults that are similarly patient, similarly willing to wait. Things that understand, in whatever passes for understanding among entities of pure warp energy or ancient corrupted technology, that the longest game is the one worth playing. If you open the door, they are ready. They have been ready for a very long time. Part 7. The Library Sanctus and What is Written. There. Not all of the secrets of Terra are sealed behind physical doors. Some of the most dangerous knowledge in the Imperium is sealed behind institutional authority and the controlled distribution of information. The Library Sanctus is a perfect example of this second kind of locked door. The Library Sanctus is described as an imperial archive located on Terra. It holds knowledge of some of the oldest and most sinister things in galactic history. The description in the available sources mentions two specific categories of contents: information about the Men of Iron and information about something called the Imgur monolith. The Men of Iron you already know about. The artificial intelligences of the age of technology whose rebellion nearly ended human civilization. The Library Sanctus holds records about them, not propaganda, not sanitized history, but the actual detailed accounts of what they were, what they could do, and where some of them might still be, including the records that acknowledge that not all of them were destroyed in the cybernetic revolt, that some survived, that at least one, the entity known as UR-025, had been wandering the fringes of Imperial space for millennia, maintaining a disguise as an Adeptus Mechanicus robot, while privately professing a faith in the Omnissiah that was, somehow, older and more genuine than the Mechanicus' own. If the Library Sanctus holds full records on the surviving men of the Iron, their capabilities, their weapons, their potential locations, then those records represent both an extraordinary intelligence asset and an extraordinary danger. The intelligence asset part is obvious. Knowing where a surviving thinking machine is would let you deal with it. The danger is equally obvious. That same information, in the hands of someone who wanted to build a new Men of Iron, rather than destroy the old ones, would be transformative. The knowledge of how to create genuine artificial intelligence, how to build something that could improve on its own design, that could plan and deceive and develop its own goals, is not something the Imperium is willing to have circulating. The ban on abominable intelligence is not just legal. It is backed by the full force of Mechanicus doctrine and Imperial law, and it persists in the 41st millennium with the same vigor it had when it was first enacted. This is 10,000 years. 10,000 years of refusing to revisit the question, of treating the prohibition as absolute, of maintaining the ban even in circumstances where a thinking machine might have been the difference between winning and losing a critical battle. Because the Imperium has done the math and decided that the short-term advantage of using AI is not worth the long-term risk of normalizing it. And in the Library Sanctus, the records that would make that normalization possible sit in carefully controlled storage, available only to people with specific clearances, guarded not by custodians with golden armor and legendary weapons, but by something arguably more formidable, the institutional architecture of an organization that has been keeping this particular secret for tens of thousands of years. The Imgur monolith is a different kind of secret entirely, and one that illustrates how the Library Sanctus is not just a repository for human history, but for information about alien threats that humanity barely understands and cannot afford to have widely known. The Imgur monolith is a Necron construct, a phase node of extraordinary power located in the Ultima Segmentum that the Library Sanctus holds detailed information about. The Necrons themselves are the resurgent robotic civilization of the ancient Necrontyr, who sold their souls and their flesh to the Citan and became immortal metal bodies, who slept in tombs across the galaxy for 60 million years, and who are now waking up and remembering that this used to be their galaxy. The Imgur monolith can duplicate Necron warships. This is not a minor detail. The ability to replicate capital ships at will, to essentially copy-paste fleet assets, is the kind of strategic capability that changes the entire calculation of a military confrontation. The Library Sanctus knows about this. The general population of the Imperium does not, and the strategic calculus of sharing that information. Who would it help? Who might misuse it? What would knowing it do to morale and political stability? Is the kind of calculation that keeps information managers in the Imperium up at night. The Vault of Origins, located deep beneath the ecclesiarchal palace on Terra, is a third variation on this theme. It holds original documents of the Imperial Creed, the founding texts of the state religion of the Imperium, alongside first-hand accounts of the Horus Heresy and the Age of Apostasy. It is sealed in a different way than the Dark Cells or the Library Sanctus. It is sealed by ancient stasis generators that keep documents from crumbling to dust. Yes, but it is also sealed by an ancient and obscure order of sentinels whose origins are described as lost to the mist of time. Even the Inquisition cannot get in. Even some ecclesiarchs, officially the most senior religious authorities in the Imperium, were denied entry after learning it existed. Why would first-hand accounts of the Horus heresy be that sensitive? Because the official history of the Horus heresy, the version taught in every scholam across the Imperium, is not the actual history. The actual history is far more complicated, far more ambiguous in some places, and far more damning to the institutions of the Imperium in others. First-hand accounts would contradict the official narrative in ways that could not be explained away. They would show the Primarchs not as godlike figures of perfect loyalty and perfect villainy, divided neatly between heroes and monsters, but as complex figures who made choices and mistakes and who fell prey to the same kinds of flaws that affect every thinking being. They would show the Emperor not as an infallible god, but as a strategist and a parent who got things very badly wrong in ways that had consequences that are still unfolding 10,000 years later. The truth, in other words. The vault of origins is sealed because it contains the truth. Part 8. The Golden Throne and the Machine that should not fail. At the center of all of this, at the literal heart of the Imperial Palace, in the chamber called the Sanctum Imperialis, sits the Emperor of mankind, and the device that keeps him alive, and the door that opens into the warp, and the mechanism by which the Astronomicon is powered. All of these things occupy the same physical space. All of them depend on each other in ways that are not fully understood by anyone currently alive. The Golden Throne was not originally a life support system. It was a portal, a device built during the age of technology, by whom exactly is not clear, though the Emperor suggested it was related to the same engineering traditions that created the webway itself, that allowed access to the webway from Terra. When the Emperor found it, it was buried under a desert in Asia. He spent centuries modifying it for his purposes, turning it from a simple portal into the nexus of his entire webway project. After the heresy, after the Emperor was placed on it in something halfway between death and life, the machine was further modified to serve its current purpose, sustaining a body that is deteriorating and cannot die, while also maintaining the psychic lock on the webway portal beneath it to prevent whatever remains of the demonic forces from the old war in the webway from pushing through into the palace. The people who maintain the Golden Throne, the Adeptus Mechanicus tech priests who perform the rituals of upkeep on a device that nobody actually understands, have been working with it for 10,000 years and have reached a deeply troubling conclusion. The machine is failing, not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually and irrevocably. The components that need replacing cannot be replaced because the specifications for remaking them do not exist anywhere in current human knowledge. The rituals of maintenance are becoming less effective. The gap between what the machine needs and what can be provided grows slightly wider with each passing century. This means the secrets sealed in the dark cells, the things contained in the Himalaic vaults, the archives locked away in the Library Sanctus, all of them exist under a deadline, not an immediate one perhaps, but a real one, because the Emperor's presence on the throne is not just about keeping his body alive. It is about the psychic lock on the webway gate. It is about the Astronomicon. It is about the fact that if the Golden Throne fails and the Emperor dies, really dies, the psychic shockwave of a being of that power actually ending would be felt across the warp in ways that nobody can fully predict. The Vulcan-installed talisman of 7 hammers, a device the legendary Primarch embedded into the Golden Throne's mechanisms, is a dead man's switch. If the throne fails catastrophically, it will detonate in a way that destroys not just the Imperial Palace, but the entire planet of Terra. This is the ultimate sealed vault, the deepest locked door of all. The Emperor himself is keeping something shut. And the failsafe for if he stops is the destruction of everything he spent his life building. Guilliman knows this. He has sat with his father. He has received the Emperor's brutal psychic transmission, the assault on his mind that told him things he cannot fully remember and cannot stop thinking about. What exactly the Emperor told him in those several minutes, or the full day that passed outside the throne room while only minutes seemed to pass inside, is not stated anywhere in the lore that is publicly accessible. Guilliman emerged white-faced, shaking, speaking of dark truths about the history of the galaxy. Whatever was transmitted, he processed it and then went to work reforming the Imperium with a sense of urgency that has the texture of someone who knows time is running out. The Primaris Space Marines, the secret project that the Archmagos Belisarius Call spent 10,000 years developing on Guilliman's authorization at the end of the heresy, are in some sense an attempt to prepare for the possibility that things get worse before they get better. Whatever Call was building, he was building it to specification, to deal with threats that Guilliman suspected might be coming. The project required centuries of work and access to biological samples and technology that pushes against the edges of what is technically permitted in the Imperium. And Call, for his part, is a figure of extraordinary opacity. He is an archmagos of the Adeptus Mechanicus, who has been continuously modified and upgraded for 10,000 years, who runs multiple cognitive instances simultaneously, who has been described as being barely recognizable as a human intelligence, despite his origin as one. He also knows things. He has been to places and accessed archives that most Mechanicus adepts would not be allowed near. He was given access to some of the Emperor's projects by Guilliman, access that would have required opening certain doors, extracting certain information, carefully using certain knowledge that was meant to stay sealed. The question of whether Call's activities represent a controlled and authorized use of otherwise sealed knowledge, or whether they represent something more dangerous, whether he has gone further than he was meant to, opened more than he was supposed to, understood more than anyone realized, is one that the lore leaves conspicuously unresolved. Part 9. The Architecture of Imperial Forgetting. There is a pattern to how the Imperium manages the knowledge it cannot safely use, and understanding that pattern requires understanding something fundamental about how the Imperium works as a civilization. The Imperium is not, despite appearances, a simple hierarchy in which the High Lords of Terra issue commands and everyone below them obeys. It is an extraordinarily complex ecosystem of competing institutions, each with its own priorities, its own secrets, its own interpretations of what serves the Emperor's will. The Adeptus Mechanicus holds certain secrets that the Inquisition does not have access to. The Inquisition holds certain secrets that the Mechanicus cannot access. The Adeptus Custodes hold secrets that neither of them can touch. The Ecclesiarchy holds secrets that even the custodians are not permitted to see. Each institution jealously protects its own information. Each institution maintains its own sealed archives. Each institution has developed, over 10,000 years, an elaborate justification for why the information it controls should not be shared with the other institutions that might misuse it, or not appreciate it, or turn it to purposes that would damage the information's custodians. This is not a design feature. It is an emergent property of a civilization that has been unable to trust itself for 10 millennia. The Horus Heresy taught every major institution in the Imperium that even the people closest to the Emperor could turn, that even Primarchs, Genesons of the greatest human being who ever lived, could be corrupted or deceived, or simply make choices that led to civilizational catastrophe. The response to that revelation was not trust. The response was compartmentalization. If nobody knows everything, then nobody can betray everything. The problem with this approach is that it compounds the original problem of the sealed vaults rather than solving it. Every time a new institution develops and builds its own archive of forbidden knowledge, a new vault is effectively created. Every time information is classified at a level that prevents the people who might most usefully act on it from accessing it, it becomes one more thing that is functionally sealed. There are records in the Administratum that have been so thoroughly classified for so long that the classification systems used to mark them are themselves no longer in use. There are files that require a countersignature from an official whose office no longer exists. There are archives that are technically accessible but practically impenetrable because the indexes needed to navigate them were themselves classified, and the people who held those indexes have been dead for millennia. The Imperium is, in part, a civilization that has been burying information at a faster rate than it can retrieve it for 10,000 years. And here is the thing about sealed vaults. Some of them need to be sealed. The dark cells need to stay shut. The things in the Himalaic vaults need to stay in. Nobody is arguing that the Imperium should throw open everything and let the public decide what to do with it. Some knowledge is genuinely dangerous. Some entities are genuinely, actively malevolent, and the only thing keeping them from the rest of the galaxy is the architecture of their containment. But the architecture of the Imperium's secrecy has grown so elaborate, so layered, so permeated with institutional self-interest and historical accident, that it is now sometimes impossible to tell the difference between something that is sealed because it poses a real existential threat and something that is sealed because sealing it was convenient for someone powerful 1,000 years ago, and nobody has thought to revisit the question since. The sealed vaults on Terra are the most dramatic version of this problem, but they are also, in a sense, the most honest version. The things in the dark cells are sealed behind physical barriers, psychic wards, and a dedicated force of elite warriors. The threat they pose is real and immediate and actively managed. The more corrosive sealed vaults are the institutional ones, the information that is locked away, not because the information itself is dangerous, but because the institution that holds it has decided that sharing it would complicate its own position. That kind of vault is everywhere in the Imperium, and unlike the dark cells, nobody is standing guard over those corridors making sure that what's inside stays there. Part 10. The Imperial Truth and Everything It Buried. There is one more sealed vault that deserves extended discussion, because it is the largest one, the most pervasive one, and the one that most directly shapes everything else in this story. The Emperor, during the Great Crusade, promoted a philosophical framework that his followers called the Imperial Truth. It was, at its core, a rationalist position, that the universe operated according to natural laws that could be understood and manipulated by intelligence, that the supernatural was not real in the way superstitions claimed, that chaos was simply a phenomenon of misunderstood psychic energy rather than an indication of actual malevolent divine beings. The Emperor encouraged science, discouraged religion, and specifically prohibited the worship of himself as a god. This was not a casual opinion. It was a considered policy built on the Emperor's understanding of how the warp works and what fuels chaos. The chaos gods feed on emotion, on belief, on the psychic resonance of sincere human conviction. An imperium of rational people who refused to worship anything was, in theory, a galactic civilization that would slowly starve chaos of the energy it needed. The imperial truth was not just a philosophical position, it was a weapon. The problem is that it was wrong, or at minimum, it was wrong in the specific way that it was deployed. The Emperor knew. He must have known, given everything he understood about the warp, that chaos was real, that the ruinous powers were genuine entities with genuine intentions, that demons were not misunderstood psychic phenomena, but actual beings with will and desire, and the capacity to influence events in real space. He was not confused about this. He was choosing to suppress this information for strategic reasons. The result was that when chaos corruption began to manifest within the legions, when the word bearers started developing sincere religious conviction, when primarchs started having mystical experiences that the framework of the imperial truth had no category to explain, there was no institutional language available to understand what was happening. The word-bearers were punished for their faith rather than understood. Magnus was put in an impossible position where the psychic abilities the Emperor needed him to have were also the abilities the imperial truth suggested he should suppress. The conditions for the heresy were created in part by the suppression of the very knowledge that might have helped people understand what was happening to them. The Emperor's grand secret, that there really were gods, that the warp really did contain beings that wanted to destroy humanity, that the universe really was in some sense supernatural, became the single most consequential sealed vault in the Imperium's history. Not because the information was actively malevolent, not because it needed a rune-locked cell to contain it, but because the institution that should have made it available chose instead to seal it behind the architecture of doctrine and denial. When the Horus heresy ended, and the Primarchs who survived began the work of codifying the Imperium, the sealed vault of the imperial truth was simply inverted rather than opened. The atheistic state became a theocratic one. The Emperor, who had forbidden his own worship, became the center of a galaxy-spanning religion that sacrifices 1,000 psychic souls to him every day. The truth about the warp and chaos, still not fully disclosed to the general population, was now framed as theological rather than scientific. But it was still filtered, still controlled, still sealed behind the same institutional barriers that had always kept it from broad circulation. In the 41st millennium, the Imperium is a civilization that has replaced one set of lies with another set of lies in the service of the same basic goal, not having the general population understand what they are actually dealing with. The official history says the Emperor is a god, that he watches over humanity, that his sacrifice on the Golden Throne is a voluntary act of divine mercy. The actual history says that the Emperor is a dying psychic being kept alive by a machine that is slowly breaking, that his sacrifice was not entirely voluntary, that the throne was supposed to be a temporary measure that became permanent when the heresy ended before the Webway project could be completed. Both versions are sealed. The official version is sealed behind the institutional authority of the ecclesiarchy, the cultural weight of 10,000 years of religious conditioning, and the fact that anyone who publicly questions it tends to be investigated by the Inquisition. The actual version is sealed in archives like the Vault of Origins and the classified sections of the Library Sanctus, and the personal knowledge of individuals like Gilliman, who emerged from an audience with the Emperor with new information and no particularly safe way to share it. The result is a civilization that is, at the deepest level, functioning on the basis of information it has decided it cannot handle. The imperial truth's legacy is not just the specific content of what was suppressed, it is the habit of suppression itself, the institutional reflex toward classifying, sealing, hiding, locking away. The Imperium learned from the Emperor that some truths were too dangerous to share, and it generalized that lesson far beyond the specific application the Emperor had in mind. Part 11. What the Noctis Aeterna revealed. When the Great Rift tore open and the Noctis Aeterna fell across the Imperium, that period of darkness and warp storm and psychic catastrophe that marked the birth of the current age, something very interesting happened on Terra specifically. The usual order of things, the delicately maintained equilibrium between what was sealed and what was free, broke down. The dark cells lost some of their prisoners. Some of the psychic wards that had been functioning reliably for thousands of years were disrupted by the shockwave of raw warp energy that accompanied the rift's birth. The things inside responded. They pushed. In some cases, they broke through. In the subterranean corridors of the Imperial Palace, during the days when the Astronomicon went dark and Terra itself was cut off from the rest of the Imperium, bands of custodian wardens fought running battles against horrors that had gotten out of their cells and were moving through the tunnels. This is information that was released carefully, through official channels, described in terms that suggest contained and managed emergency response rather than civilizational catastrophe. And the custodians did manage it. They fought the things back. They resecured most of what had gotten loose. The cells were reinforced and rewarded after the immediate crisis passed. But some of the cells that had been breached were empty. The things inside had been taken, not escaped, whisked away into the warp or teleported to locations unknown, apparently by the same dark forces that were simultaneously attacking Terra. Something had specifically reached into the dark cells and extracted certain prisoners during the chaos of the rift's opening, while the Shadowkeepers were occupied with more obvious threats. This suggests a level of planning and foreknowledge that is deeply unsettling. Whatever extracted those prisoners knew they were there, knew approximately what they were, knew the specific moment when the seals would be disrupted enough to allow removal. This is not opportunistic looting. This is a coordinated intelligence operation executed in the middle of an apocalyptic crisis against the most heavily guarded location in the known universe. Who did it? The lore does not say. The Shadowkeepers are now hunting across the galaxy for what was taken, which means that whoever took it has had months or years to work with. Whatever they extracted, whatever was removed from those cells, is out in the galaxy now, in someone's possession, being studied or used or demonstrated or prepared as a weapon. The Noctis Eterna did something else on Terra besides breach the dark cells. It brought the Cornate demonic assault on the Imperial Palace that became informally known as the Second Battle of Terra. A vast horde of Khorne demons tore through the skin of reality and attacked the Lion's Gate, the outer gate of the palace, in an assault that was designed as the killing blow that would end the Imperium in a single stroke. Guilliman and Valoris and the full force of the Adeptus Custodes drove them back. But the fact that this happened at all, that daemons physically assaulted the Imperial Palace in force for the first time in 10,000 years, tells you something about the new reality of the 41st millennium. The seals that kept the warp at a manageable distance from Terra are not what they were. The barriers between real space and the immaterium are thinner. The defenses that protected the most sacred location in human space have been tested and found to be penetrable in ways they were not before. The sealed vaults exist in a more hostile environment now than they did when they were created. The things inside some of them are more agitated, more alert, more actively pushing against their containment. The psychic wards that were laid down by the Emperor himself and that have been functioning for 10,000 years were disrupted by the rift's birth. Some of them have been restored. Some of them may not have been. The full extent of the damage to the containment infrastructure of the deep cells and the Himalaic vaults is not publicly known. What is known is that the Shadowkeepers, for the first time in their history as a formed organization, have deployed warriors off Terra on a sustained basis. Their mission is active retrieval rather than passive guard duty. This is a significant change. It suggests that the balance has shifted enough that simply maintaining the vaults is no longer sufficient. Whatever was in there and got out needs to be caught and returned. And the Shadowkeepers are confident, or desperate, enough to leave their primary station to go after it. In the deepest operational sense, the sealed vaults are no longer entirely sealed. The 41st millennium has created a situation where some of what was locked away is moving again for the first time since it was contained. The game has changed, and the people tasked with maintaining the status quo are adapting, which means the status quo itself is no longer what it was. Part 12. Why they stay sealed. The calculus of the unopened door. So we have covered the history, the age of technology and the men of iron, the age of strife and everything it buried, the Emperor's great work and what it kept hidden, the dark cells and the Shadowkeepers, the Himalaic vaults and their living occupants, the Library Sanctus and the Vault of Origins, the vaults of Moravec and the price of forbidden knowledge, the Noctis Eterna and what it changed. The question that remains, the question that the title of this video promised we would answer, is why, after all of this, after 10,000 years of need and desperation and crisis after crisis, nobody opens the sealed vaults on Terra. And the answer The actual answer has several layers. The first layer is the most obvious one. Some of the things in those vaults genuinely cannot be safely opened. The dark cells contain entities that, if released, would be catastrophically dangerous. Not in the way that a powerful weapon is dangerous, something that could be pointed at an enemy and used, but in the way that a plague is dangerous, something that spreads in directions you did not intend, that affects things you did not want affected, that changes the environment in ways you cannot undo. The entities in the dark cells are not weapons, they are hazards. Opening those cells would not give the Imperium an advantage. It would simply release something terrible into an already terrible galaxy. The second layer is about knowledge specifically. Some of the sealed archives contain information that is not dangerous in the direct, physical way that a caged demon is dangerous. But the information has downstream consequences that are genuinely civilizational. If the truth about the Men of Iron were fully disclosed, the surviving ones, the capabilities they have maintained, the weapons technology from the cybernetic revolt that might still be accessible, it would create enormous pressure on the prohibition against artificial intelligence. If enough people knew that certain kinds of AI had survived and were functioning, the argument for recreating AI on the grounds that it would give the Imperium an edge would become very difficult to resist. And the last time that argument won, it nearly ended everything. The third layer is political. The Vault of Origins contains information that would contradict the official history of the Imperium in ways that would be deeply destabilizing. The Ecclesiarchy's power rests in significant part on the specific narrative it has constructed about the Emperor, the heresy, and the founding of the Imperium. If the first-hand accounts in that vault were released, the questions they would raise about the official account would not be manageable. In a galactic civilization under existential pressure from a dozen directions, a crisis of faith in the central religious and political mythology is not something anyone can afford right now. The vault stays sealed, not because the truth inside it would physically harm anyone, but because it would harm the structures that are currently preventing everything from collapsing. The fourth layer is the one that Guilliman's story illustrates most clearly. Some of the sealed vaults contain knowledge about things the current leadership of the Imperium does not have a plan to address. The Emperor told Guilliman dark truths during their meeting in the throne room. Guilliman emerged from that meeting with new urgency and new determination, but also with things he has kept to himself. He has been described as wrestling with his former atheism, reconsidering his beliefs about the Emperor's nature, carrying the weight of what he was told. He is working around the edges of whatever he learned, implementing the changes he can implement, but he has not simply announced everything he knows and asked the Imperium to respond. Because he understands something that most people in his position eventually learn, the response to certain truths. In a civilization as stressed and paranoid and institutionally rigid as the Imperium, is not rational consideration. It is panic, fragmentation, betrayal, and the exploitation of any acknowledged vulnerability by every entity that is currently waiting for an opening. The sealed vaults stay sealed, not just because of what is inside them, but because of what opening them would do to the people and institutions on the outside. There is a fifth layer, and it is perhaps the most interesting one philosophically. Some of the sealed vaults are sealed by decisions that no one alive today made, about threats that no one alive today fully understands, using techniques that no one alive today can fully evaluate. The custodians fighting their regular skirmishes in the Himalaic tunnels are fighting things they cannot identify, using protocols established by people whose records have been lost, based on containment logic that may or may not still be valid. The people who sealed the dark cells used wards that the Emperor himself helped design, and the Emperor has been on the throne for 10,000 years and is not available for consultation. Opening a sealed vault requires you to know two things: what is inside and whether you can handle what is inside. In too many cases, the Imperium currently lacks reliable information about either. The records are incomplete, classified, damaged, or simply too old to be trusted at face value. The capabilities to respond to what might emerge are uncertain. The institutional knowledge that would allow a responsible evaluation has been lost to 10,000 years of bureaucratic entropy and deliberate suppression. So the doors stay shut, not because the people in charge have made a confident, well-reasoned assessment that the contents should stay contained, but because they have made a much simpler calculation. We do not know enough to make a confident decision, and the consequences of being wrong lean asymmetrically toward catastrophe. When the potential downside of opening a door is the destruction of the Imperium and possibly the planet it sits on, when the fail-safe mechanism built into the Golden Throne literally destroys Terra if things go badly enough wrong, the threshold for "we are confident enough to try" is very, very high, and that threshold has not yet been met. Not in 10,000 years. Part 13. The Weight of Unopened Doors. There is a passage in the description of the dark cells that keeps coming back to me. It says that even though neither sound nor light can escape the cells, the air of those corridors is charged with dread, that a perpetual menace thickens the shadows and makes them crawl, that even the custodians, beings of extraordinary physical and spiritual fortitude, warriors who have guarded the most important location in the galaxy for their entire lives, are forever on edge in those dark corridors, and the sense of threat never wanes. Think about what that passage is describing. It is not describing physical danger in any direct sense. Nothing is attacking the guards. Nothing is getting out. The cells are sealed. The wards are intact. The locks are holding. And yet, the air is wrong. The shadows move wrong. The sense of something enormous pressing against the inside of those locked doors is persistent and impossible to dismiss, and it does not matter how long you stand there. It never stops. That is what the sealed vaults of Terra are, in their deepest essence. They are the accumulated weight of everything humanity has ever done that it could not face, everything it built and then had to lock away, everything it discovered and then decided it could not afford to know. They are not just physical spaces. They are the shape of the Imperium's relationship with its own history, the visible architecture of 10,000 years of deliberate forgetting. And they are still there, every single one of them. The dark cells with their century-long standing guards, the Himalaic vaults with their regular, grinding, never-ending security operations, the library sanctus with its careful custodians and its records of things that cannot be widely known, the Vault of Origins, with its ancient sentinels and its first-hand accounts of history that the Imperium's official version cannot accommodate, the wreckage of the Webway project in the deep dungeons beneath the Golden Throne, the records of experiments in the Emperor's gene laboratories that have never been released because their full scope and their full ethics have never been reconciled with the image of the Emperor as either a great leader or a god. Guilliman has been described as a man trying to keep a civilization alive under circumstances that would have broken anyone with less conviction and less discipline. He has access to more of the truth about the Imperium than almost anyone else alive. He knows what is in those rooms, at least in outline. He has been to the throne room. He has done the math. And he keeps governing, keeps fighting, keeps pushing back the darkness with every tool available to him, while carrying the knowledge that beneath the palace, that is the center of everything, humanity is trying to defend. There are doors that cannot be opened and will not be, for as long as the civilization requires its current architecture of necessary deception to function. The sealed vaults are not a secret that will be revealed in a moment of narrative triumph when the right hero finds the right key. They are structural. They are load-bearing. The Imperium as it currently exists depends on them staying shut in the same way it depends on the Golden Throne continuing to function and the Astronomicon continuing to shine and the custodians continuing to stand their watch in halls that no one else is allowed to enter. But the Great Rift is open now. The Noctis Eterna came and went and changed the landscape. The cells are more permeable than they were. The things inside are more restless. The guards have had to leave their posts and go hunting across the galaxy for what got out. The Golden Throne is failing slowly, and the smart money says it will fail completely before anyone finds a way to fix it. The history of the Imperium is full of things that were supposed to stay sealed that eventually were not. The vaults of Moravec were sealed, and then Horus found the key. The webway portal was sealed, and Magnus's spell found the crack. The Chaos Gods were sealed away from human awareness by the Imperial truth, and the heresy found the weakness in that doctrine. Every sealed vault in the Imperium is a bet against time, and time, in the 41st millennium, is running very short. The question is not whether these doors will ever open. Some of them already have. The question is whether, when the remaining ones do, anything will be left on the other side to face what comes out. That is the weight of the sealed vaults. That is why nobody opens them. Not because they are unimportant, not because the people in charge have forgotten about them or given up on them, but because in the grim darkness of the far future, the things you cannot afford to know are the things that define the shape of everything you are trying to protect. The doors stay shut, because behind each of them is a version of the truth that the Imperium is not ready to survive. And maybe, after 10,000 years of war and sacrifice and quiet desperation, it never will be. If you made it all the way to the end of this one, genuinely, thank you. This is the kind of lore that rewards the deep dive. The more you understand about the history of Terra and the history of the Imperium, the more the sealed vaults stop being a curious world-building detail and start being the central tragedy of the whole setting. A civilization built on secrets, guarded by warriors who cannot tell you what they are guarding, surviving because it refuses to look directly at what it actually is. If this was the kind of content you want more of, please do hit the like button. It helps this channel reach the people who want to spend an evening going very quietly and very deeply into the darkest corners of the lore. And if you are new here, welcome, settle in. There is a lot more where this came from. Subscribe if you want to stay. And until next time, sleep well, if the doors let you. Q on 40,000, where the lore goes quiet and the darkness listens. Extended section. The keepers, the known, and the deeply unknown. There is a figure who appears in the lore almost in passing, mentioned in a single paragraph that has since become one of the most intriguing breadcrumbs in Warhammer 40,000's historical record. His name is Cripias. He holds the title of Keeper of the Library Sanctus of Terra. In the year 993 of the 41st millennium, he completed a document he had spent 70 years compiling, a history of humanity assembled from the archives he had spent a lifetime managing. He noted that he was not the first keeper to work on this project. He was working in the tradition of his predecessor, Master Phineas, and of Master Shadiel before him, and of 836 generations of keepers of the Library Sanctus, stretching back into the deep past. 836 generations. If you take a conservative 25 years per generation, that is over 20,000 years of custodians maintaining this archive and this tradition. The Library Sanctus is not a recent institution. It is not something the Imperium built after the heresy to manage its more sensitive knowledge. It predates the Imperium itself. It predates the Unification Wars. Its roots reach back through the Age of Strife and potentially into the Age of Technology that came before, maintained through the collapse and the darkness and the long rebuilding by a succession of human custodians who kept the records alive across the generations. And Cripias is the one who finally wrote it down, who took all the oral traditions and the fragmented records and the things that had been passed from keeper to keeper without being committed to durable storage and turned them into a text. A history of humanity, from before the beginning of recorded Terran civilization to his own time. What would be in that text? What would 836 generations of carefully maintained oral tradition, drawing on the archives of the most sensitive knowledge repository on humanity's home planet, actually contain? The accounts of the Men of Iron, yes, we know that. The information about the Imgur monolith, but what else? What did Crippius know that he considered too important to leave unrecorded and too sensitive to circulate widely? The Library Sanctus is sealed. The text that Crippius produced, assuming it survived, would be in that sealed archive, available to a very small number of people with very specific authorization. Read, perhaps by nobody since it was written, but it exists. Somewhere in the deep levels of the Imperial Palace complex, in a facility maintained by the descendants of Crippius's tradition, that document is sitting, waiting, containing whatever an 800-generation oral tradition of the most careful archive keepers in human history actually accumulated over 20,000 years of collecting the things humanity could not afford to forget and could not afford to share. The existence of this document, and of the Library Sanctus more broadly, points to something that is easy to miss in discussions of the sealed vaults. The difference between knowledge that is sealed because it is dangerous and knowledge that is sealed because the institutions that hold it have decided it needs to be held carefully. These are not the same thing, and they require different analysis. The dark cells and the Himalaic vaults are sealed because what is inside them is actively dangerous. The things in those cells would cause immediate physical harm if released. The weapons technology from the cybernetic revolt might be reusable in ways that would be catastrophic. The entities from the Age of Strife have intentions that do not align with human survival. But the Library Sanctus is different. The history of the Men of Iron, written down and carefully maintained, is not itself dangerous in the way that a caged demon is dangerous. It is dangerous in a secondary way, in the way that all comprehensive information is dangerous in a society that has decided certain questions should not be asked. The danger is not that the text would physically harm anyone who read it. The danger is what they would do with it, the questions it would raise, the conclusions it might lead them to, the actions it might inspire. This is a civilizational choice, and it is one that the Imperium makes continuously, with extraordinary consistency, across every institution and every level of governance. The decision to seal certain knowledge is not usually made on the basis of the knowledge's inherent properties. It is made on the basis of an assessment of what the people who might access that knowledge would do with it, and whether those actions would serve or harm the stability and survival of the Imperium as a whole. Sometimes this assessment is correct. The prohibition on artificial intelligence, backed by the records of the cybernetic revolt in the Library Sanctus, is a case where the assessment seems reasonable. The catastrophic potential of recreating true AI in a galaxy that is already struggling to survive against a dozen existential threats is a real concern that does not require paranoia to justify. The ban is harsh, and the institutional enforcement of it is occasionally brutal, but the reasoning behind it is not irrational. Sometimes the assessment is self-serving in ways that have nothing to do with real danger. The Vault of Origins, sealed beneath the ecclesiastical palace, is a case where the primary motivation for keeping the doors locked appears to be the protection of the ecclesiarchy's institutional authority rather than any genuine safety concern. First-hand accounts of the Horus heresy are not going to physically harm anyone who reads them. They are not going to cause warp incursions or release ancient horrors. They are going to complicate the official narrative. They are going to raise questions. They are going to make certain things that are currently believed to be simple look complicated, and certain people who are currently believed to be heroes look more human, and certain institutional choices that are currently treated as divinely ordained look more like political decisions made under pressure. The Inquisition is specifically barred from the Vault of Origins. The organization whose entire mandate is the investigation of threats to the Imperium is not allowed inside the most comprehensive archive of historical information about one of the greatest crises in Imperium history. This is not a security decision. This is an institutional protection decision. The ecclesiarchy has decided that the Inquisition's interest in the truth, as an organization, poses a greater threat to the ecclesiarchy's position than the Inquisition's absence from those records poses to their own Imperium's security. The people who make decisions about what stays sealed and what gets opened are not, generally speaking, custodians or scholars. They are politicians and bureaucrats and institutional heads who are operating within a framework that they themselves did not design and which has been running for so long that most of them have never seriously considered the possibility that it might need to be fundamentally revisited. The architecture of imperial forgetting, as I described it earlier, is self-perpetuating. Each new generation of decision-makers inherits a system that treats secrecy as normal and disclosure as requiring special justification, and most of them do not have the inclination or the political capital to challenge that inversion of the usual burden of proof. Guilliman, when he returned, tried to push back against some of this. He reorganized the High Lords. He published the Codex Imperialis. He attempted to restore some version of the rationalism that the Emperor had originally intended the Imperium to embody, even while recognizing that the specific vehicle of the imperial truth had long since been superseded. He asked hard questions about the Golden Throne and what could be done to extend its function. He authorized Call to pursue projects that involved carefully accessing certain sealed archives for specific purposes. But even Guilliman has not opened the sealed vaults. He has worked around them, drawn on specific pieces of their contents with surgical care, but he has not made a general policy of disclosure. He understands the political constraints better than almost anyone. He knows that the stability of the Imperium, fragile as it is, depends in significant part on the same structures of secrecy and controlled information that he finds philosophically uncomfortable. Tearing those structures down, even in service of genuine enlightenment, would cause damage that the Imperium cannot absorb right now. So he does what he can. He uses what he is allowed to use. He tries to build a slightly better version of the civilization he inherited, with the tools he has. And the vaults stay sealed because he cannot afford to open them, and he knows it. Extended section. The Custodian's Burden. A meditation on eternal watch. It is worth spending some time with the custodians themselves, because they are arguably the most important characters in the story of the sealed vaults, and they are also perhaps the most misunderstood figures in the entire Warhammer 40,000 setting. The popular imagination tends to picture the Adeptus Custodes as the Emperor's ceremonial bodyguards, beautiful golden armor, guardian spears, standing in rings around the golden throne, attending the body of their lord in a kind of extended funeral that has been going on for 10,000 years. This is not wrong, exactly, but it misses most of what makes the custodians remarkable. A custodian is not made the way a space marine is made. Space Marines are mass-produced in a sophisticated but essentially industrial process, genetic modification applied to large numbers of candidates, with a relatively straightforward progression from recruit to battle brother. There are tens of thousands of Space Marines in the galaxy at any given time. The process of creating them, while extraordinary, is documented and repeatable. Custodians are made one at a time. The process used to create them is described as involving the Emperor himself, as originating with genetic modification techniques that the Emperor developed and that he alone fully understood. No two custodians are exactly the same. Each one is in some sense a unique creation, a specific response to the properties of a specific individual, developed and refined over years or decades of careful modification. The custodians are not Space Marines raised to a higher power. They are something different in kind, not just degree. The practical implications of this are significant. There are at most 10,000 custodians in the galaxy at any given time. When one dies, replacing them is a slow process. They cannot be quickly mass-produced in response to casualties the way Space Marine chapters can, in theory, expand recruitment. They are finite, precious, irreplaceable in the short term, and they are tasked with guarding not just the Emperor's physical person, but every secret connected to him, every vault and archive and sealed chamber that his long reign accumulated, every door that he sealed and that needs to stay sealed, now that he is not available to reseal it himself. The custodians know things. This is the part that the ceremonial bodyguard image obscures. Individual custodians have been alive for centuries. Some of them were alive before the heresy. A small number were present at specific events during the heresy that are not fully documented in any official history. They carry memories that no one else carries. They hold knowledge that is not written down anywhere, because the Emperor gave it to them directly, in person, in the way that only a being of his psychic capability could. Not as verbal briefings, but as deep psychic imprints that sit at the level of the custodian's consciousness alongside their own memories. The Shadowkeepers specifically have developed their own oral traditions about the dark cells. The Shield host has been maintaining the cells for so long that their institutional knowledge of the specific containment needs of specific prisoners, the idiosyncrasies of the wards on specific cells, the patterns of behavior that the entities inside display over long periods. This knowledge exists in the Shadowkeepers' collective memory, rather than in any written record. It is transmitted from senior custodians to new initiates in the same way that the Library Sanctus's oral tradition was transmitted by Keeper Cripias and his predecessors. Person to person, generation to generation, knowledge too sensitive to commit to materials that might be captured or copied. This means that if the Shadowkeepers were ever seriously depleted, if something were to eliminate most of them at once, that institutional knowledge would be lost. The locks might remain intact, the wards might still function, but the specific protocols for maintaining them, the understanding of what would happen if a particular cell's ward failed and what the correct immediate response was, would be gone. The cells would be sealed by engineering that nobody understood, and the Imperium would be left with vaults it knew were dangerous but could no longer properly manage. The fact that the Shadowkeepers have been sending warriors off Terra since the rift opened, leaving their primary station for extended periods for the first time in their history, is significant precisely for this reason. For every Shadowkeeper who is out in the galaxy hunting escaped entities, there is one fewer Shadowkeeper in the corridors of the dark cells. For every operation outside the palace, there is a slight reduction in the depth of the guard at the most important containment facility in human history. This is a calculated risk, one that Valoris and the Shadowkeepers' leadership clearly decided was worth taking. The entities that escaped during the Noctis Eterna need to be retrieved. Leaving them loose in the galaxy is unacceptable, but the calculation involved in deciding to thin the guard on the remaining cells is not one that leaves much margin for error. There is a record in the lore of the custodians that mentions an incident in an unspecified millennium between the 33rd and the 39th. A space hulk, one of those vast conglomerate masses of fused spacecraft that drift through the void, usually carrying extremely unpleasant stowaways, was detected heading toward Terra from the outer dark. The Hulk was detected sufficiently in advance for a response to be organized, and the response was led by the Lock Warden of the Shadowkeepers, personally, who took a force of his warriors inside the Hulk and destroyed it from within. The wider Imperium was told only that the Hulk had been dealt with and need have no concern. Why did the Lock Warden lead this mission personally? Why was the destruction of an approaching Space Hulk a priority so high that the leader of the most important guard force on the planet left their post to deal with it? The Imperium has space marines. It has the Imperial Navy. There were presumably other options. The Lock Warden's personal involvement suggests that the Hulk contained something specifically relevant to the Shadowkeeper's mandate. Something that, if it had been allowed to land or to transmit from orbit, would have posed a threat not just to Terra generally, but to the specific things the Shadowkeepers guard. Was something from the dark cells on the Hulk? Had one of the escaped entities, or a descendant or a copy of one, made its way back toward Terra by hitching a ride inside a drifting ruin of a spacecraft? Were there forces on the Hulk that knew about the dark cells and were coming to try to liberate something? The lore does not answer these questions. It simply states that the Lock Warden handled it personally, that the Hulk was destroyed, and that the wider Imperium never needed to know any more than that. The phrase, "the wider Imperium need never know any more than that," is doing a great deal of work in that sentence. It is the voice of an institution that has been managing secrets for so long that the management has become reflexive, automatic, the default setting for how they relate to every situation. The custodians carry the weight of all of this history in a way that no other organization in the Imperium does. The Space Marines are proud warriors with chapter histories and battle honors and a culture that looks forward to the next campaign. The Inquisition is activist and investigative, perpetually moving, perpetually looking for the next threat. The Administrator manages the present-day bureaucracy of a galaxy-spanning empire and lives almost entirely in the current moment. But the custodians live with the full depth of what the past has left behind. They guard the physical residue of 10,000 years of human history and the specific artifacts and entities and vaults that history produced. And they do so knowing that most of what they guard cannot be fixed or resolved or improved upon. It simply needs to be maintained, contained, kept from getting worse. This is a particular kind of burden. It is not the burden of fighting an enemy you can eventually defeat. It is the burden of maintaining a status quo that provides no satisfaction and requires no triumph. The Shadowkeepers do not win. They hold. They hold against entropy and chaos, and the slow deterioration of containment systems, and the periodic attempts of their prisoners to escape. They hold forever, until they cannot hold anymore, at which point they fight whatever gets out and put it back and start holding again. The longest record of continuous vigil in the Silent Company, the 300 custodians who stand their watch directly around the Emperor's body, never resting, never moving, is held by a custodian named Astoran Kalos, who stood his post for 100 years without relief. 100 years of standing in the same spot, watching the same dying light, listening to the same quiet sounds of life support machinery, keeping alive a body that should have died 10,000 years ago. 100 years. And then he stopped, not because he chose to stop, but because after a century of perfect vigilance, his reaction time had slowed by 1/10 of a second. By the standards of the custodians, this made him unfit for the post. He was removed from the rotation. The post was given to someone whose biology had not yet begun its infinitesimal decline. This is the kind of institution that guards the sealed vaults of Terra. These are the standards it holds itself to. 1/10 of a second slower, after a century of perfect service, and you are no longer good enough for this particular duty. The Emperor's protection and the protection of everything connected to it demands perfection, and the custodians have been delivering it, to the best of their ability, for 10,000 years. Extended section. What Belisarius Cawl knows. There is a figure in the contemporary history of the Imperium who deserves extended consideration in any discussion of sealed vaults and forbidden knowledge, because he is one of the few beings in the setting who has actively and deliberately accessed sealed archives for specific purposes with authorization, and who has been doing so for a very long time. Belisarius Cawl is the Archmagos Dominus of the Adeptus Mechanicus. He is also, by this point, something that is difficult to categorize. He has been continuously modifying and upgrading himself for 10,000 years. He runs multiple cognitive instances simultaneously, versions of his consciousness that exist in parallel, each handling different aspects of his awareness and processing. He has been described by the people who interact with him as barely recognizable as a human intelligence, despite his biological origin as a human being. He is old in a way that custodians are old, in the sense that he has personal memories of events that most beings in the 41st millennium know only as mythology. At the end of the Horus Heresy, Guilliman gave Cawl an extraordinary commission. He authorized the Archmagos to pursue a decades-long project to improve upon the Space Marine template, to create a new kind of genetically enhanced warrior that would address the weaknesses inherent in the original Astartes design, while also having access to certain biological and genetic resources that the Emperor himself had developed. This became the Primaris Space Marine project, which came to fruition 10,000 years later, when Kol unveiled what he had built, and the first Primaris warriors were deployed. What resources did Kol need access to in order to complete this project? What archives? What sealed vaults? What experimental records from the Emperor's own gene laboratory did he need to consult? The project required, at minimum, detailed knowledge of the original Space Marine enhancement process, the Primarch gene seed that underlies it, and the specific genetic engineering techniques that the Emperor used in creating the Primarchs themselves, techniques that are described in the lore as being uniquely the Emperor's, not replicated by anyone else. The Emperor's gene laboratories beneath the Himalayan mountains are among the most restricted locations on Terra. The records they contain, the technical documentation of the Primarch project, the experimental notes on the Space Marine enhancement process, the data on the genetic architecture of the transhuman warriors the Emperor created, are among the most sensitive archives on the planet. Kol would have needed access to at least some of this, and the authorization for that access would have had to come from somewhere very high up. What exactly Kol found when he looked through those records? What additional things he discovered that were not strictly necessary for the Primaris project, but which he examined anyway, because 10,000 years of curiosity is very difficult to suppress. This is not stated. What we do know is that Kol has developed, over his long life, a perspective on the Imperium and on human civilization that is unusual even among the most senior figures in the setting. He does not speak about the Emperor in the same reverent terms that the ecclesiarchy uses. He has doubts, or things that function like doubts. He has been to places and seen things that have given him a picture of human history that is more complete than most. When Guilliman emerged from his audience with the Emperor and began wrestling with questions about the Emperor's nature and divinity, he turned to Kol for perspective. Kol, for his part, provided information about the Emperor's own statements on these matters, drawing on what appear to be either archived records or direct knowledge of things the Emperor said and did in the period before the heresy. Kol knows more than he says, and what he says is already more than almost anyone else. This makes him a peculiar figure in the landscape of the sealed vaults. He is not a guardian of these vaults. He is an authorized user of some of them, someone who has been given specific access to specific records for specific purposes, and who has, presumably, seen things in those records that were not strictly relevant to his stated mission, but which he encountered anyway, because you cannot browse an archive without occasionally reading the margin notes. The question of what Kol has done with that excess knowledge, the things he found that he was not looking for, the records he encountered that went beyond his authorization, is one that the law raises implicitly without answering. Kol is described as someone who is not constrained by the usual institutional limits on what can be known. He pushes at boundaries. He pursues knowledge that others would leave sealed. He does so with a kind of cheerful, ancient, enormous curiosity that is difficult to characterize as either reckless or careful, because it operates on a timescale that makes both categories hard to apply. The Primaris project itself is a kind of sealed vault made manifest. The knowledge it represents, the biological and genetic technology required to produce Primaris-grade enhancement, represents a capability that nobody outside Kol and his most trusted inner circle fully understands. If that knowledge were broadly available, if the techniques Kol developed were accessible to any sufficiently equipped laboratory, the implications for the Imperium would be significant. But Kol holds it carefully. He releases it in controlled ways to specific parties under specific circumstances. He has become, in some sense, a vault himself, a living repository of things that are too powerful and too consequential to be widely distributed, managed by a consciousness that has been running for 10,000 years and that has developed its own sense of what can be safely known and what needs to be kept close. There is something poignant about this. Call represents, in the 41st millennium, the closest thing the Imperium has to the kind of careful, curious, long-view thinking that the Emperor himself brought to the early Imperium. He is not a perfect heir to that tradition. He is an archmagos of the Adeptus Mechanicus, shaped by that institution's particular pathologies and priorities. But he is old enough to have perspective that most beings simply do not have, and he has used that perspective, imperfectly but genuinely, to try to prepare the Imperium for the challenges ahead. The sealed vaults he has accessed, the knowledge he has drawn from them, the technology he has developed, all of it represents a controlled opening of certain doors, a carefully managed release of certain sealed things, done in service of Guilliman's broader project of trying to make the Imperium something that can survive the era it currently occupies. Whether it will be enough is a question that the 41st millennium has not yet answered. Extended section: The Galaxy Remembers and the Vaults that are not on Terra. No discussion of why nobody opens the sealed vaults on Terra would be complete without acknowledging that Terra is not the only place where dangerous secrets are kept, and that the decision-making logic that keeps the Terran vaults sealed operates across the galaxy as well. The story of the vaults of Moravec is instructive here precisely because it is a case study in what happens when a sealed vault is opened. The vault was on Mars, not Terra. The decision to open it was made by the Fabricator General under the influence of Chaos Corruption and in exchange for an alliance with the traitor Warmaster Horus. The opening accelerated the schism of Mars, which was itself one of the contributing factors to the catastrophic scope of the Horus heresy. The forbidden knowledge inside the vaults was not simply information about dangerous technology. It was information that had been contaminated by chaos, that actively spread corruption on contact, that transformed the people who accessed it into instruments of the very forces that had originally provided Moravec with the means to build it. This is the model that the Imperium's institutional decision-makers are working from when they think about sealed vaults. Not a theoretical model, an actual historical precedent that ended in the near destruction of the Imperium. The vaults of Moravec were opened, and the consequences were felt for the next 10,000 years. Every time someone in a position of authority thinks about whether to access a sealed archive, or release a classified piece of information, or break a containment protocol, somewhere in the back of their institutional memory is the vaults of Moravec and everything that followed from opening them. The galaxy is full of dangerous knowledge. The Elder Webway contains sections that are flooded with chaos, and that the Drukhari, the Dark Elder of Komarach, have to fight continuously to prevent from spreading into their city. The Necron tombs, scattered across 100 worlds, contain technology that makes the Adeptus Mechanicus's most advanced achievements look primitive. And the Necrons, who are waking up in those tombs, carry memories of events that predate human civilization by 60 million years. The Tyrannid hive mind is itself a kind of sealed vault, a consciousness of incomprehensible scale that exists on frequencies human minds cannot access, that has been probing the edges of the Imperium for generations, and which knows things about the galaxy and about humanity that humanity does not know about itself. Even within the Imperium, the sealed vaults are not limited to Terra. Every major world has its classified archives. Every inquisitorial stronghold has its restricted collections. The Adeptus Mechanicus maintains sealed vaults on every Forge world, containing standard template constructs that are deemed too dangerous to implement, experimental records that produced results too alarming to share, the records of projects that went wrong in ways that could not be explained to the wider Mechanicus without causing mass heresy. The pattern is consistent. The Imperium accumulates knowledge it cannot use and then seals it. It encounters dangers it cannot eliminate and then contains them. It discovers truths it cannot reconcile with its own official narrative and then classifies them. The sealed vaults of Terra are the most dramatic and most historically significant examples of this pattern, but they are not exceptions. They are the archetype. The whole Imperium is, in a sense, a civilization built around the management of things it has decided it cannot handle. What makes the Terran vault specifically significant is the combination of age, contents, and strategic importance. The things sealed beneath Terra have been there longest, and are therefore the most completely forgotten in terms of specific contents, the most thoroughly integrated into the containment architecture, and the most deeply connected to the Emperor's original intentions for the Imperium. They are also, by virtue of their location, the most consequential if anything goes wrong. A vault breach on a distant forge world is a regional crisis. A vault breach beneath the Imperial Palace is something else entirely. The Sol system, for all its density of human population and Imperial infrastructure, is also one of the most psychically active places in the galaxy. The Emperor's presence, even diminished and constrained as it is, radiates an enormous amount of psychic energy. The Astronomicon amplifies this. The presence of so many psychers in the service of the Adeptus Astronomica concentrates warp-adjacent energy in the mountain ranges. The proximity of the webway portal beneath the Golden Throne means that even with the gates sealed, the membrane between real space and the labyrinth dimension is thinner near the palace than almost anywhere else in the galaxy. This psychic intensity has two effects that are relevant to the sealed vaults. The first is protective. Many of the entities in the dark cells and the Himalaic vaults are constrained not just by physical locks, but by the ambient psychic field generated by the Emperor's presence, however faint that presence has become. The wards work partly because of their own engineering, and partly because of the background psychic resonance of the most powerful human mind in history, even in its current diminished state. The second effect is permissive. The same concentration of psychic energy that helps maintain certain wards also makes the area attractive to warp-capable entities, things that want to access the psychic currents flowing through the palace complex, things that can sense the presence of the Emperor's power and are drawn to it, whether to destroy it, feed on it, or simply because proximity to that kind of power is intrinsically meaningful to entities that are themselves made of psychic force. This creates a permanent low-level tension around the sealed vaults that does not exist in the same way anywhere else in the galaxy. The things inside the dark cells can feel the Emperor. The demons and the entities from the Age of Strife and the corrupted technologies of the cybernetic revolt are all, in various ways, oriented toward the psychic field that surrounds the Golden Throne. This makes them more agitated in the current era, as that field weakens slightly with each passing year that the throne degrades. They can feel the weakening. They push against their containment more insistently, and the Shadowkeepers feel this pressure in the corridors they walk every day. The air that is wrong, the shadows that crawl, the dread that never wanes. Extended section. The vaults in the context of the gathering storm. In the years immediately preceding the opening of the Great Rift, a period that the Imperium calls the time of the gathering storm, the sealed vaults began showing signs of increased activity that the custodians' reports describe with their characteristic economy of language. The Years of Madness is a recorded period in custodian history in which a series of strange events began accumulating within and around the Imperial Palace. It started with the disappearance of a captain general who had been leading the custodians through a period of unusual conservatism. Cult activity across the Sol system increased sharply. Doomsday sects began operating within the palace's outer districts, recruiting from the desperate masses of pilgrims and palace servants. The psychic readers, the doom scryers of the Tower of Hegemon, began producing false predictions, and eventually it was discovered that some of them had been possessed. And in the dark cells, the reports from the Shadowkeepers noted growing agitation. The servitors responsible for maintenance and repair work in the outer corridors of the complex began exhibiting sudden violent madness. Not all of them, not at once, but with enough frequency that it constituted a pattern, a signal, something that the cells were doing deliberately rather than incidentally. This is what it looks like when things in sealed vaults know that something is coming. Not a dramatic warning, not a psychic broadcast, or a physical assault on the locks. Just the slow escalation of ambient wrongness, the maintenance servitors going mad, the doomscryers receiving false visions, the cults suddenly multiplying outside. A pattern that any individual element could be dismissed as unrelated, but that together reads, to the careful eye of an institution that has been watching for exactly this kind of signal for 10,000 years as preparation. Preparation for what? For the Great Rift, presumably. For the opening of the Cicatrix Maledictum and the Noctis Eterna, and all the consequences that followed. The entities in the dark cells could feel it coming. Whatever mechanisms of perception are available to beings of their nature told them that the galaxy was about to change in ways that would affect their situation. They began, in whatever limited ways were available to them, to get ready. The Shadow Keepers got ready too. They reinforced their numbers. They ran the induction trials for new members faster than usual, sacrificing some of the traditional depth of the process for the sake of numbers. They opened ancient vaults, not the prisoner vaults, but the armory vaults, and distributed relic weapons that had been in storage since before any currently living custodian could remember. They consulted the doomscryers, even knowing that the predictive capacity of those unfortunate psychers was compromised. They recited their purification mantras, and they reinforced the wards, and they watched. And then the rift opened, and the Noctis Eterna hit, and multiple cells were breached, and the Battle of Lion's Gate happened on the surface while custodians fought running battles in the tunnels below. And when the dust settled, and the Shadow Keepers took stock of what remained, some of what had been sealed for thousands of years was gone. The fact that the Shadow Keepers had been preparing, had anticipated the crisis even without knowing its exact form, and still could not prevent the breaches. This is not a failure of vigilance or capability. It is a demonstration of scale. The Great Rift is not the kind of threat that any amount of preparation can fully anticipate or counter. It is a galaxy-rending psychic catastrophe, the single largest warp intrusion into real space since the fall of the Aeldari. Against something of that magnitude, the best that careful and vigilant guardians can do is limit the damage. Some cells held, some things were kept in. The sealed vaults of Terra did not fail completely, and for that the galaxy owes the Shadow Keepers a debt it will never know to pay. But some cells are empty now, and whatever was in them is out there, somewhere in the galaxy that is darker and more chaotic than it was before the rift. In someone's hands, or no one's hands, or in the hands of something that does not have hands, but does have intentions. The Shadow Keepers are hunting. The sealed vaults that remain sealed are sealed more tightly than before. The watch continues. It always continues. That is the final answer to the question this video set out to answer. Why does nobody open the sealed vaults on Terra? Because the people who guard them have been standing in those dark corridors long enough to understand something that most of the Imperium citizens will never be allowed to know. The sealed vaults are not relics of a more dangerous past. They are the infrastructure of the present. They are the architecture that stands between the Imperium and the full weight of everything it has ever refused to face. And the day someone decides to simply open one, not to retrieve a specific thing for a specific controlled purpose, but to simply open it and see what is inside, is the day they discover exactly why it was sealed in the first place. Some doors are closed for a reason. In the 41st millennium, the doors beneath Terra are closed for the best possible reason of all. Because the alternatives, every single one of them, are worse. The Emperor knew. The custodians know. And the things inside the vaults, patient and ageless and waiting in the dark, know that somewhere out there, someone is always tempted. They are very good at waiting.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.